these documents, and based on that they will prepare their notes, and the inspection will go on in this way. So it's mostly it would be looking at the procedures, the processes which are in place, and based on that there would be. Yes, Jatin, you have a doubt.
Sir, can you define the pharmacovigilance program, like with an example? Their
Pharmacovigilance.
program, effectiveness of pharmacovigilance program,
Okay,
like
okay. So basically, if you look at the so here what the pharmacovigilance program refers to is different departments which are there within the premises. Like for example, when you look at a MAH, there would be a pharmacovigilance department, right? And within the pharmacovigilance department, again, there would be different sub processes. There would be a case processing team, there would be a medical assessment team, there would be an aggregate report writing team, and they may not be located at the same site. They may be located at different sites, at different locations. They may not be physically present in the same country as well. It could be like it could be in different countries. Apart from that, internally, so what happens is when a pharmacovigilance audit happens, these these departments, they could be individually audited. Like for example, when we had an audit when I was working for Pfizer, we had we basically had three departments. So we had a book in or case intake team, wherein which what used to happen was any adverse event report which was received from any source. It could be from a spontaneous source, or it could be from a solicited source, um, or any adverse event report that was received. So that was one department. So what they used to do, they used to do the duplicate check, and based on that, they used to create a case. The case used to be registered, or a case number was generated, and from there on, what they used to do was they used to process it. And the second one was the case processing team. So in case processing team, what happened was we used to receive. So we used to do the intake. We used to get the intake of the case done from spontaneous reports, which and the intake was not done in India. It was done in some other country. It was done in Shanghai, and we used to receive those reports in which were booked in, and a case number was created, and we used to further process it. When I say further processing, um, I'm talking about further processing of the case in the database, like which includes coding of the events, coding of suspect drugs, writing narratives, scheduling action item when you are sending out letters to HCP or non-HCP. And then there was a third department which comprised of first line, frontline work, or frontline HCPs, and their responsibility was to take calls from HCPs, from patients, from physicians, even from the regulatory agencies at times. And based on that, if there was any adverse event identified during the process of call, they used to document it. So when the audit happened, they and we call them as SOW. SAW stands for Statement of Work. So there were three SOWs, three defined SOWs. So each of these SOWs were audited. They were audited for their different roles and responsibilities to which they were accounted to. Like for example, the audit which the and this SAW which were responsible for taking the calls and creating adverse event reports. It was called as Pfizer Safety Contact Center. So what used to happen was, so what happened? So when the audit happened in this department, what they saw was they saw that how are we doing the probing? The scope of audit was limited to the probing that was done, documentation of the adverse events in the database. So earlier we used to use, like I have shared the science form with all of you. We used to have an adverse event forms, and we used to fill it using pen. And it was a physical copy we had. It was a physical document we had, a physical book we had, and that was called as telephone contact sheet. So whenever we got a call, we used to probe, and based on the responses to these questions, we used to fill out these telephone contact sheets. And once the telephone contact sheet was filled, we used to then complete a adverse event form similar to the SIAMS form. And once the SIAMS form is completed, then we used to send it out to the book-in and case intake team. So we used to call it as the book-in and data entry team. So it used to go to another SOIN where it was processed in the Argus database. So when the audit was done, what they specifically checked for was effective probing done? Were we asking, let's say, those important questions which would remove any sort of ambiguity? Like, for example, what are some of the questions we need to ask when we are, when we are probing? So if the patient says that if the patient says that he took, let's say, Tylenol, or he took Advil. So Advil was one of the famous products with Pfizer. So if the patient says that, I took Advil, and after taking Advil, I'm experiencing rashes all over my body. So if that happens, so what are the questions? What are some of the questions, would you ask, Jatin? What comes to your mind? What would you ask the patient?
No, sir. I'm clear. I was just asking for the pharmacovigilance program. I get a clear view all now.
Sorry.
I get the part with the pharmacovigilance program. It's like a team with divides with specific tasks.
Yes. But yeah, so moving on to that part, so what would be some of the questions that you would ask as part of the probing? Like, when you come across a situation when which patient presents you with a case, like for example, the patient says that he's experiencing fever or rashes on a specific drug. What are some of the questions which you would ask the patient?
Like you have taken any medication with it, or have you done anything beside your daily routine, other things.
Precisely. So you would be asking questions associated with the event onset date. You would be asking the questions associated with the start date of the suspect drug, the indication, the dose, and when you do that, so these are the questions, some of the questions which you need to probe. So when the audit happens, so the auditor will look for these. Are we doing effective probing? That's the first part of it. The second part is that once you're doing the probing, or once you're making any physical notes on let's say on the telephone contact sheet, then what would you do is, how are you archiving those reports? So as per the so when you talk about good pharmacovigilance practices, a lot of other things are also linked with these documents. Like you have good pharmacovigilance practices, which is also linked with good documentation practices. So when we look at the good documentation practices, there are some, um, there is what we call as document control, wherein which how are you archiving these records? And we happen to visit the regulations by US FDA, by European Medical Agency, and also by Health Canada, wherein which we saw that these documents are archived for 25 years, because they are health-based documents. So the auditor, so what happens is when an audit happens, it trails the audit trails from one area to the other. So we are talking about effective probing. From effective probing, the auditor might want to know what is the SOP on document control. Do you have, or what is the SOP on record retention? If you look at the good pharmacovigilance practices of Health Canada, GUI 0102, you would see that, and in the section, I think C 0.22, you would see that it speaks about record retention. And even if you look at the good pharmacovigilance practices, there's a regulation on record retention which tells us that um, we have to retain the records for almost 25 years. Ideally, it should be lifelong, but there's at times it's 25. In some regulations, it is mentioned as 25 years. So then, then comes a part where in which you're filling those AE forms, and once you're filling those AE forms, it is then submitted. So when you're filling the AE forms and when it is submitted to data entry, is there any quality metrics, you know, that gauges the quality of the AE forms which you're filling, which you're completing? So that's what it says over here. It says that the person will review the quality management system, which is used to collect, code, process data for independent case study reports. The qualification of the staff performing the pharmacovigilance and the roles and responsibility of the European qualified person for pharmacovigilance. So, so when we're talking about the quality management system, what are we talking about here? So we're talking about the quality matrices that are available. And when we talk about the quality metrics, we're talking about what are the parameters on which we are gauging the quality of the reports. So ideally, there should be a baseline. So when we're talking about baseline, baseline would be there would be some components on which the quality of individual case safety reports are measured. So what could be that? That could be divided into components like critical components, which would include. So what do you think would be those critical components which would be required for an effective or for a good case safety report? Some of the critical components here would be that there should not be any ambiguity on the suspect drug. Some of the other critical component would include that there should not be any ambiguity on the adverse event. So when we talk about suspect drug, what are the areas that we should be aware about? So when you're talking about suspect drug, you need to have information about the name of the suspect drug, the date when the patient started the therapy, the dose of the suspect drug, the indication, and then you need to have information about event, the patient, reporter. So all of this. So you need to have those at least those information correct, which will make the case valid, and probably those could be your critical points, on based on which you're giving a quality score. But if one of those points are missing, it means that the probing was not effective, or probably the patient. There could be several reasons. Probably the patient did not decline. Probably the patient declined for to be contacted for further information, or the patient was not comfortable in providing those information. So on those basis, the quality system is checked. So and then once you have the information, then it is processed in the safety database. So when we are processing it, then the next question which the auditor would ask is like, the database which you're using, is it validated? And we have seen the 21 CFR Part 11 regulations, wherein which we saw the significance of validation of the safety database. So when we're talking about validating a safety database, what are we talking about? We are saying that there should be the database should be validated, so that it is compliant as per the 21 CFR Part 11. And if it is compliant, then what would happen is we would have so if it's compliant, then we can submit reports from the safety database to the regulatory agency. So hence that is how an audit would lead. So it may just start from a single department and would eventually go on to other departments. It would ask, it would basically uh, touch base upon, at times, the IT department. They might ask for the document on the validation, and they might also say, if your database is validated, it was any spot checks that was done. So spot checks are part of um, POs, which is called as PQ, which is called as performance qualification. So was the database, now we are using Tara PV. So in Tara PV, did we ever randomly check a function to see if that function was working correct? So that is called as a spot check. So if we are doing that, then you need to have also a report on that. And that report is again reviewed. So this is an example of how an audit is conducted. So it may just trail from one place, and may just touch on the other departments as well. Okay. So we discussed yesterday about the different types of findings. So we talked about critical, major, minor. So who can give me an example of a critical finding? Anyone? Or who can give me the name of the document that we used to understand the difference between a critical